Have you seen the new Fear the Invisible Man yet?
We have barely begun.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but there were a few ways that it sort of reminded me of the 2020 Invisible Man movie with Elisabeth Moss, and it sort of got me thinking, where did all this Invisible Man stuff start anyway? Well, today we'll be breaking down the history of H.G. Wells' creation and watching some terrible movies while doing so. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can join me next time. I'm gonna be breaking down some more mythical beasts and monsters, and our next video is gonna be all about the Wolfman.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms. The autumn moon is bright.
So if you're a fan of freaks like me, then trust me when I say that you're gonna want to see what's coming next. But anyway, the Invisible Man. He's a lot easier for us to trace the origins of than mummies were. Really, he's a lot more like Frankenstein in the sense that he got his start from a novel. English writer Herbert George Wells, better known as H.G. Wells, hit it big in the mainstream when he published his 1895 novel, The Time Machine. It's a cute story, definitely worth a read if you're into the whole idea of time travel, but for our purposes, I'm mostly bringing it up because it set Wells up over the next couple of years to keep publishing groundbreaking works of science fiction. In 1896, he released The Island of Dr. Moreau, then followed that one up the following year with the story we'll be focusing on today, The Invisible Man. Wells apparently got the idea for the story when he read The Perils of Invisibility by W.S. Gilbert, which includes the line, "Old Peter vanished like a shot, but then his suit of clothes did not." And The Invisible Man sort of reads like an entire book of, well, that. It isn't a horror story, is what I'm saying. It's more of a mystery/comedy with some horrifying ideas in it. Griffin, the scientist who uncovers the formula, becomes more and more aggressive in his attempts to keep himself safe against a world who continuously turns against him and tries to hunt him down like an animal. In the end, Griffin tries to get bloody revenge against an old friend, Dr. Kemp, for turning him into the police, and this leads to an entire crowd of people stomping poor Griffin to death. They all watch as he becomes slowly more visible and then just sort of move on with their lives. But don't feel too bad for Griffin, he was never too good of a guy to begin with. When he first gets the idea to turn himself invisible, he spends the next 3 years working on it diligently without ever once considering the consequences. He even steals money from his dad to fund his research, something that leads to his dad dying by suicide. But Griffin doesn't seem to care all that much. He first tests his formula on a stray cat who comes to him for food, and it's clear that the process tortures the poor kitty, but he just sort of does his thing and then sets an invisible cat loose on the streets of London. I would adopt it if I could find it. And all that wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that the second that he becomes invisible, he's all like, yeah, this sucks, I want to be visible again. Like, dude, do you not realize how much suffering you've already caused so you can have this? Another detail that may surprise you from the book is that Griffin is actually albino, and it's only because of this that the invisibility formula works on him. Wells went into depth about how exactly the serum was supposed to work, mostly by allowing light to pass through the body rather than reflect off of it. Which, by the way, it's impressive that he put so much thought behind it, but at the same time, this method should have rendered Griffin blind, since the human eye works by absorbing light. H.G. Wells was also convinced that the only part of the human body that couldn't be dyed invisible was the pigment, hence the whole Griffin being an albino thing. This would be a detail that was immediately dropped from the very first movie, 1933's The Invisible Man. There, Griffin discovers the formula working with something called monocaine.
A little of this injected under the skin of the arm every day for a month.
Which the movie states is known to drive anyone who comes in contact with it violently insane.
He knows something about monocaine even you don't know. It alters you, changes you, makes you feel differently.
In the book, Griffin was just straight out studying light from the beginning. Interestingly enough, the book does mention that Griffin is dependent on strychnine, which is highly toxic, and the book even describes it as the devil. It's the Paleolithic in a bottle. Griffin is said to be more agitated when he takes it, and it may even explain some of his more violent outbursts, but it's never implied to be among the list of chemicals that turned him invisible or anything. anything. The movie sort of collapses Griffin's breakdown into happening because of his invisibility, but in the book, it's a lot more complicated than that. Griffin is overworked and near poverty when he uncovers the formula. He very clearly has an overinflated sense of self because he's discovered this secret. He's not dealing with his dad's death, and on top of all of that, he has this chemical dependency that's actively poisoning his body. And it all comes together in this perfect storm when he's hunted for his invisibility. The special effects in this movie are gorgeous, especially for the time period. Griffin's invisibility scenes would be filmed in front of a set covered completely in black velvet. And then they dress the actor in head-to-toe velvet, along with any other clothes he was supposed to be wearing for the scene. Griffin, by the way, has a much higher death count in this movie than he does in the book. Yes, Griffin promised to unleash a reign of terror upon the city close to the end of the book, even printing out this little ad in the newspaper. It's adorable, really. This is day one of year one of the new epoch, the epoch of the Invisible Man. I am Invisible Man the First. To begin with, the rule will be easy. The first day there will be one execution. The first day there will be one execution for the sake of example, a man named Kemp. This is that moment I mentioned earlier when Griffin declares revenge against an old friend, Dr. Kemp, and ends up getting stomped to death by a crowd. So that was a long reign of terror. Griffin does kill one man who he just comes across in the street. It's implied that this man was following him for a while and that Griffin was afraid he'd give away his secret, and that Griffin felt super bad about it afterwards. It's not quite the Griffin from the movie is what I mean, the one who derails a train killing hundreds. But that does bring me to the one big thing that these two versions have in common. They're both about the joy of getting away with doing bad things. Griffin in the book is constantly whipping off his clothes and running around naked in a way that I can only imagine was meant to make kids laugh. Well, in the movie, Griffin seems to be having fun with the whole invisibility thing.
Good morning, Grandfather. How do you do?
Up until the moment things go too far.
I meddle in things that man must leave alone.
Both versions of Griffin enjoy having the upper hand over their victims.
An invisible man can rule the world. He can rob and rape and kill.
And it's that very same glee that makes him both fun and horrifying to watch. The idea of invisibility being used for mischief would become a major theme in media after this, like in Season 4, Episode 8 of Supernatural, Wishful Thinking, where a teenage boy wishes to be invisible so that he can spy on women in the shower.
Put on some pants and stay visible.
But Griffin was really the one that started the whole thing. Wow, he really is Invisible Man the First, isn't he? He sort of feels like Dr. Frankenstein mixed with the Joker in a way, and where would the Joker be without his Harley? The 1933 movie gives Griffin a fiancée named Flora, who's actually the only person to get him to soften.
Why did you do this?
For you, Flora, I was so pitifully poor. I had nothing to offer you, Flora.
That wouldn't have happened in the book. There, Griffin was always extremely dismissive towards anyone that wasn't him. He even runs into an ex-girlfriend after attending his father's funeral and describes the whole encounter by saying, "Something moved me to turn back and talk to her. She was a very ordinary person." That's it. He just sort of moves on after that. Griffin only ever describes people as ordinary or ugly. It's very clear that he doesn't see anyone as an equal to himself. Which is part of the reason why I think the 2020 version has such an interesting take. It would be a lie to say that this movie is more book accurate than the original movie, but there are certain details that manage to catch the essence of the book a bit better. Things like the fact that we're never given Griffin's perspective. In the book, everything was told to us by some outside third party, and here we're seeing the story through the eyes of Griffin's ex-girlfriend, Cecilia. The movie opens up with her escaping from her abusive boyfriend and trying to get her life back on track. only for her to learn that he's apparently died by suicide. It's at that point that she starts receiving visits from someone invisible who seems to be trying to mess with her, and she becomes convinced that her boyfriend's faked his own death and found some way to turn himself invisible so that he can keep tormenting her, which of course turns out to be the truth. This movie has Griffin become invisible using some sort of high-tech suit, meaning that he's able to choose to become visible and invisible again at will, whereas in the book he's pretty much immediately tormented by the need to find a cure. This definitely goes a long way toward making him a lot more sinister, but if I had one complaint about the movie, it would be that there really isn't a lot to Griffin here. He's just some guy who enjoys tormenting people and has the means to do it. This movie does a great job of exploring important issues like reproductive abuse, gaslighting, and triggers, in a way that can be sort of hard to sit through sometimes. Still, I could see a younger version of myself absolutely loving this movie for the way that it discusses such heavy topics in such a serious way. But if I were to watch a movie with these themes for fun, I'd probably go for something like the 2017 Invisible Man. I feel like I'm spoiling the movie by describing it this way. I really don't like comparing it to a better movie right off the bat. But this movie really feels like what would happen if you wrote The Invisible Man into David Cronenberg's The Fly. A scientist, tormented by his son's horrific murder years prior, begins work on an invisibility serum along with his lab partner, who he winds up developing feelings for. The problem is, she's conflicted by an obviously abusive ex who won't go away. In a moment of depression, the scientist decides to test the serum on himself and winds up going through an agonizingly long process turning invisible. Once he's invisible, his girlfriend is suddenly interested in him again, seeing this as an opportunity to further both of their careers. But he sees this as an opportunity to not only get back at his son's killer, but to find out what's going on between his girlfriend and her ex once and for all. The story goes to an interesting but kind of confusingly handled place of abuse between the scientist and his partner at some point, with a lot less focus on how it affects the victim than the 2020 movie gave us, but with a more realistic descent for the Invisible Man. I have the feeling that between these two stories, we'd have the perfect version of the whole Invisible Man does abusive relationship story. Man, it's weird that that's becoming a subgenre. And speaking of that subgenre, 2023's Fear the Invisible Man also places Griffin in a toxic relationship with a woman. And like the 2020 movie, it's a lot more interested in exploring the girlfriend's point of view than Griffin's. It manages to stay pretty accurate to the book, even quoting from it directly at some points.
It's a beast of a country, and pigs for people.
Some extraordinary things in books.
This is day one of year one of the new epoch. The epoch of the Invisible Man.
But it also doesn't write in any new female characters for Griffin to date. Instead, they gender bend Griffin's old friend, Dr. Kemp, and change their backstory to make it so that she was the wife of one of his old schoolmates who Griffin had a crush on. This change actually makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know why more adaptations don't make Dr. Kemp a love interest for Griffin. I feel like it heightens the betrayal on both sides, both when Dr. Kemp finds out that Griffin's gone crazy, and when Griffin finds out that Kemp has turned him into the police. This movie is also the only adaptation I've seen that includes the character of Thomas Marvel, despite the fact that he has such an awesome name. In the book, he's a homeless man who Griffin bullies into helping him for a bit, but he ultimately turns against Griffin and steals his research, even implying at the end of the story that he may plan on following Griffin's research notes and becoming invisible for himself. Things end a little differently for Marvel in this movie, but it is a fairly new movie, so I don't want to spoil too much. 1940's The Invisible Woman is notable for being the first time that we'd actually see a woman be turned invisible. This movie was actually pretty scandalous at the time too, because even though the main character was invisible the whole time, she was also naked. How the world has changed in the past 80-some-odd years. Virginia Bruce plays a department store model who sees an ad in the paper posted by a scientist looking to test out his new invisibility machine, and she sees this as the perfect opportunity to get back at her bad boss. They eventually find out that her new invisible state isn't permanent, but alcohol seems to help her stay unseen. Eventually, the machine is stolen by a group of bad guys, and it's up to the Invisible Woman to save the day. Obviously, this movie is a lot more slapsticky and comedic than anything we've seen up to this point, which was probably an early indication of the direction monster movies would be taking over the coming years. The Invisible Woman was the third movie in the original Invisible Man franchise, following 1940's The Invisible Man Returns. Although it has nothing to do with any of its predecessors, and all other sequels just sort of ignore it. So you can sort of think of it like the Halloween 3 Season of the Witch of the Invisible Man franchise. A 1983 remake was attempted as a TV series, and although they did manage to turn the pilot into a made-for-TV movie, the rest of the series never managed to get picked up. And again, in 2019, Elizabeth Banks announced that she was working on an Invisible Woman reboot. But since we haven't heard any news since then, I'm guessing it's probably been cancelled along with the rest of the Dark Universe. If you wanted to know more about the Dark Universe, I go into more depth about it in my Mummy video. The 2000 movie Hollow Man gives us one of the darkest interpretations of the character we've seen, and that's saying something. Here, our Invisible Man is a bit of a creep to begin with, but he uses his newfound invisibility to his advantage in order to commit sexual assaults. It's disturbing for sure. Although we've already seen invisible men spying on women in showers with Supernatural, that example was used for laughs, and plus it was a teenage boy doing it who the show went out of their way to characterize as being creepy, but more or less harmless.
You actually walked up to a wishing well, dropped a dime, and wished to be invisible so you could spy on women in the shower.
No.
Hollow Man just straight up goes to one of the worst places your mind can go, and I really don't know why this feels so much uglier than Griffin using his invisibility for murder. I don't know. Both aren't good, obviously, but the mental damage that he's doing to his victims here just feels so cold and calculating that I really have a hard time getting behind this version of the character. Fun fact, I actually remember my parents letting me watch this one when I was like 3. I was so excited to watch this movie back for the video. I told my partner and everything, like, wait until you see this one. I grew up watching it. It's such a good movie. It was not the way that I remember. And I genuinely do not know why my parents let me watch that one. I'm pretty sure I was just into the concept of somebody turning invisible at the time. I imagine the rest of you discovered that concept watching something like Invisible Mom. We have the entire Griffin family this time. Papa Griffin is a scientist who started performing his own experiments at home, leading him to discover a formula for invisibility that he first tests on the family dog. Turning invisible isn't quite as painful a process in this movie as it is in the book, which is good because otherwise I would revolt. Baby Griffin sneaks into Papa Griffin's lab so he can steal some of the formula, but he puts it in a pop bottle so Mommy Griffin winds up drinking it thinking it's pop. Thus, Invisible Mom. This movie's message is pretty clear. The mom feels pretty invisible from minute 1, and so her invisibility becomes an excuse for her to let her hair down and have a little fun. I say a little because she still spends a good amount of this movie stressing about how to get back to normal, but at the end everyone learns to value Mom a little more, and I guess that's never a bad thing. The movie can be a little heavy-handed with its message, like, I don't know who would either make or buy this shirt.
My mom is no one. Sometimes it feels that way.
But it's cute enough, and like the Invisible Woman, our Invisible Mom is actually a bit of a hero. This time, we're fighting against Papa Griffin's boss, who wants to steal the formula for himself and tries to kidnap Mommy Griffin in order to do it. It's cliche, but it's using one of the major themes from the book, which is the idea that scientists and academics are often taken advantage of. Papa Griffin struggles to make anything worthwhile with his thieving boss breathing down his neck, whereas Griffin in the book struggles to do anything because he just can't seem to get together the financial means. Both men are driven to perform their experiments no matter what, and both men would have had a much easier time of it if they'd actually had access to the proper resources. Really, this movie is surprisingly book accurate, considering it's called Invisible Mom, and it was directed by a guy whose filmography includes things like Bikini Frankenstein and Bikini Cave Girl. Lot of bikini movies, really. But if you wanted to see the Invisible Man in more of a superhero type thing, look no further than The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Originally a comic series created by writer Alan Moore and artist Kevin O'Neill in 1999, it follows a team of characters from Victorian literature who have been recruited on behalf of British intelligence to protect the interests of the British Empire. Think the Avengers with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde playing the part of the Hulk. Holly Griffin was one of these such characters, although the movie changed it around to be a thief named Rodney Skinner who had stolen the formula off of Griffin and used it to become invisible himself. This change was mostly made because 20th Century Fox couldn't get the rights to H.G. Wells's book. They also changed the name of The Invisible Man to An Invisible Man to avoid copyright. It's so frustrating too. It feels like such a missed opportunity to not make the thief Thomas Marvel, but nope, didn't get the rights to the book. Why even bother? Honestly, the Invisible Man features very little in the movie too. He paints his face with grease paint, so he's not really invisible. And besides that, the only other thing he does is want to have sex with Sean Connery.
Easy now, Alan. I'm feeling a bit of a draft in my nether regions, and I must say, it's quite refreshing.
And are you a good boy?
I guess you'll find out, won't you?
If my dad were here, he would say same. I don't have quite the same taste in men as my dad, but I felt like someone needed to speak for him. An Invisible Man saves the day alongside our heroes at the end, although in the comic he isn't quite so heroic. He actually rapes and murders several people in the comic just because he can. It's not as flattering a portrayal as it is in the movie, I'll leave it at that. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen comic is also the only version of the story I've come across that actually references Griffin being an albino. Although it only comes up insofar as to mention that Griffin used the corpse of some random albino guy as a stand-in for his own, thus explaining how he's able to participate in the events of the comic. But if you wanted a version of the story that makes the Invisible Man its actual hero, there's the 1958 British TV series H.G. Wells's Invisible Man. This story also sees him recruited by British intelligence. Why does that keep happening to him? And he uses his powers of invisibility to actually help people for once. It's a weird take if I'm being honest. The Invisible Man here is almost the exact opposite from how he is in the book. Charming, likable, willing to share his secret, it's weird. The series itself runs more or less like a straightforward spy thriller from the era, but it's definitely interesting to note just for being such a strangely heroic version of the character. But you know, I can't help but notice that the only times we turn the Invisible Man into a hero is when he's an invisible woman, so obviously less aggressive in the minds of these old school male writers, or he's working for some sort of secret, shadowy government organization that we can't know anything about. Probably actually run by villains, if we're being honest here. And meanwhile, the Invisible Man's reputation as a villain has been so complete that even Castlevania, Portrait of Ruin used him as a one-off villain without ever needing to go into his backstory. This floating hat and trench coat has become such an iconic image in our culture that his story isn't even all that necessary to hear anymore. We know who he is, and his reign of terror continues to this day. What's your favorite version of the Invisible Man story? It can be a book, a movie, an episode of a TV show, whatever. If I find something new that interests me, I might do a shorter spin-off video on it later, and you could definitely be a great help for me in that. Thank you so much for joining me here tonight, my friends, and remember, you have less to fear from spirits than you do from underfunded scientists with anger issues, I guess. Pleasant dreams. Special thanks to my supporters on Patreon, Wilson Elricks III and Eric Hobia. If you'd like to become a part of our little monster squad, just know that everybody's welcome. Hitting that subscribe button is a surefire way to become a member, but the Patreon link is there in the video description if you'd like to receive some bonus perks along the way. Things like early access to videos and scripts, and your name called out at the end. Until next time, my friends. Invisibility, 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 invisibility. It's starting to sound weird.